Hello guys and welcome. Okay, today in geography we're going to look at urban settlements. So this is just a massive reminder for next week. Please send in questions regarding terms 2's work. So some of the questions that came through, thank you very much for them, is terms 1's work, for instance climatology. I'm going to discuss a couple of questions regarding that, as well as geomorphology. But please let us concentrate on the content for term 2. Because we do not know when we're going back to school, so at least we can learn through this process. But let's get back straight into it. So I've got a couple of questions. Thank you very much for that. I just want to see who sent me these lovely questions. And it was Tetlo Nare. Thank you very much for these questions. And it's regarding settlement. So let's quickly have a look at these questions. The first question, very importantly, as you know geography by now, we need to look at our diagrams. Now, if you look at the diagram being provided over here, I tend to tell my learners that most of the answers is right in front of you. You just need to be able to go and look for them and what do you see on the diagram themselves. Now, first of all, immediately, if you look at the figure 3.4, it's the urban land use zones. Now, let's just quickly have a look at urban. What does urban means? Now, we look at urban settlements and we look at rural settlements. Very importantly, when we look at rural settlements, we focus mainly on primary activities, such as farming, fishing, forestry, and mining. When we move to urban settlements, we focus on secondary, tertiary, quaternary activities. The best possible example I can give you of an urban settlement is Johannesburg. Now, if you go back to your diagram, so we're basically discussing urban settlements and we look at the land use zones over there. Now, immediately, just looking at the diagram there, I've spotted A, and I can guarantee that is the CBD. What does CBD stands for? Central Business District. And if you look at the information given on the diagram, you've got transition zone, then we've got the OBD, outlying high-rise buildings. I'm just going to write there, OBD. A beautiful example, we can use Johannesburg as an example, the OBD, outlying high-rise buildings. For instance, Sandton, that's an outlying business district. Then obviously we look at our different residential areas. Now keep this in mind, grade 12s, we have 3 different residential areas. Low income residential areas, middle income residential areas, and high income residential areas. Now, before I'm going to go back to the diagram, we just quickly, let's just discuss the 3 different income residential areas. Our low income residential areas we usually find very close to the CBD. The simple reason why is because it reduces traveling cost. Your high income residential areas is usually furthest away from the CBD. And because of the property stands are much bigger as well. Going back to our diagram, we can see the residential areas, there's one quite far out. So I'm definitely bargaining on that being in a high income residential area. As you can see, there's a low income residential area. And very importantly, if you look at B, the heavy industrial zone, usually on the outskirts of urban areas. Now, when we look at heavy industrial areas, you need to keep in mind, these are businesses, industries that never close. It's usually shift working, that continues working, it never stops. And these industries create a hell of a lot of pollution and noise pollution as well. So that's the reason they tend to be on the outskirts of urban areas. Now, going back to our diagram, there's a couple of keys I want you to concentrate on. Now, obviously we can see over here, there's a key, it represents roads. Now, do you agree with me that all roads lead to the CBD? Okay, as you can see, all of the roads, transport routes lead to the Central Business District. Now, this is the beauty of geography. We haven't even looked at the question, but we have answered so many different aspects regarding this diagram. So let's quickly go and have a look at the questions. Now, question 3.4.1, identify the land use zone. Now, if we go back to our diagram And if we look at A, we already identified it. We look at our first answer, and that will be the central business district. Now, it's very easy to be able to identify the central business district. It's usually in the middle of your urban areas. It's usually high-rise buildings and most congestion taking place over there. So if we go to our second question, 3.4.2, what evidence suggests that land use zone has a high degree of accessibility? Once again, we've answered that question just by looking at the key that's been presented on this image. As you can see, accessibility is all major routes leads to the CBD. So that means it's very accessible because major routes lead to it, to the CBD. Once again, we basically answered this question without even looking at the questions, because all the answers were right there in our diagram. Now, indicate how the accessibility of land use zone A impacts on the morphology of the buildings. Now, that's quite important. If we go back to our diagram, as you can see, the CBD consists of high-rise buildings. Now, when we look at the CBD, the property is most expensive over there. So instead of the city expanding, what's happening with the CBD? They're moving up with the buildings. Because of the property stands, it's too expensive to expand, so that it's rather better to go up. Now, if you look at the question, let's just go back to the question, indicate how the accessibility of land use zone A impacts on the morphology of the buildings. It's high-rise buildings. So we will find our tallest buildings in the CBD. Just go back to the next question. Now, 3.4.4, draw a labeled urban profile from B to C. So I just want to clean my diagram a bit before I'm going to continue with this question. So they've asked you to construct a urban profile. Now let's just quickly define what is an urban profile. Now, an urban profile is a side profile of an urban area. So it's basically a cross-section from one point to another point through an urban area. So let's just quickly continue, and I'll go and draw. If we look at our diagram, we need to go and construct an urban profile from B all the way to C. Now, if we look at that urban profile, it's basically a cross profile. For instance, over here, we start right in the middle. We got our high-rising buildings over there. I'm using Joburg. There's the Hillbrow Tower, and there's the Ponte. Then we got transition zone over there. And then we have our low-income residential areas closest to low income. And then as we move further from the CBD, we have OBDs. For instance, Sandton is a very good example, high-rise buildings, outlying business districts. And next to the low-income residential areas, we usually have our middle income residential areas. And usually furthest away, we have our high income residential areas. And on our rural urban fringe, let's just quickly define the rural urban fringe. As when we move from urban areas to the rural areas, we usually find our heavy industries on the outskirts. Why? Because of the amount of pollution that's being created, noise and air pollution, as well as being able to access the transport routes much better. Okay, so that's our urban profile. It's basically a cross-section of our urban area, a side view of our urban area. Now, if we look at question 3.4.5, answer the following questions with reference to the transition zone. Why are the buildings in the transition zone poorly maintained? Now, if you look at your textbook, they will usually tell you that many of the buildings in the transition zone is being dilapidated, meaning they look sketchy, they're not being cared for, and it looks rough. The reason for it is because, remember, urban areas tend to expand. So when they expand, people tend to move away. So what happens, where it used to be the rural, next to the CBD, if we look at the transition zone, people used to live there, but they tend to move away because what happened? The urban area started to expand and different opportunities arise all over our urban area. But if we go and look at our next question, and it's a very interesting question, and I love this question, give a reason for the high land values in the transition zone. So in contrast, we've just mentioned that these buildings are dilapidated, they look sketchy, and they look run down. But if you look at the property value, it's still very high. The simple reason for that, grade 12s, is because it's so close to the CBD. Now, if you look at property value in the CBD, it's extremely high. We already discussed that question earlier when we looked at the buildings, the high-rise buildings, because buildings are rather going up than expanding because of the property value that's so high in the CBD. So that will answer our question that because it's close to the CBD and it's got high property value. Okay, let's continue to our next question. Give 2 reasons for the location of the heavy industrial zone. Once again, grade 12s, before we even looked at the questions, we looked at our diagram. Okay, and we discussed the heavy industrial zones. Where do we find them? On the outskirts. Simple reason, they need to be connected to important routes to transport these goods, or maybe because of the amount of pollution that they create, noise and air pollution. So if we look at these questions regarding the urban settlement, just want to thank Tenfold for these questions. Thank you very much, and they will definitely help preparing yourself for this term's work.